Brethren, it is an honor and a privilege to be back here with you as part of Valley of St. Louis's virtual education series. Tonight, I am coming to you live actually from our library here in St. Louis. There are about 10,000 volumes on the books surrounding me, and we've got another 6 or 7 up in our research library. So it's an honor and pleasure to be coming from our cathedral to you. Tonight, we have the great opportunity to have one of our study groups meeting behind me in our lounge. And those guys will be filing in later to kind of sit in for this discussion as well. But I'm glad to be down here in our beautiful building and to discuss with you tonight's topic, Regalia of the Rite, an exploration into the early regalia and uniforms of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. I would, again, as always, remind everyone our perspective this evening is the Southern jurisdiction, the Mother Council, and we're going to work from those statutes, those rituals, those regulations. So the Regalia of the Rite, from the perspective of what we're going to discuss tonight, my brothers, is going to be very limited in terms of we're not going to talk about everything. I believe down the road we are going to kind of break apart the jewels and really dig into the aprons a little bit in their evolution. Tonight, we're going to specifically focus on the primary pieces of regalia that a Scottish Rite Mason would be quote unquote entitled to or have authority to wear, if that makes sense. But that said, I want to make it very clear, we do have in development a discussion on all of these different jewels and kind of the symbolism behind them and how they all fit together, probably more than we think. That's just a couple months down the road. With that said, we're going to talk about where we started and where we've come to today. And this is kind of the real tricky part of it in terms of development, because over time, things change, perspectives change, regalia mindsets change. Very much what we may think of as rudimentary concepts in terms of, well, that makes sense, that's affordable, that's proper. Those things change. Of course, 100, 150 years ago, wearing a jacket and tie or being much more formal was much more par for the course than it is in today's metric. And as such, that's going to be reflected somewhat in the scope of the ritual we see as we go from, a much more elaborate to a much more simplified arrangement. These are two pictures that often catch Scottish Rite Masons' attention, and they're ones I want to draw your mindset to for a minute. The first one is Albert Pike wearing a collar, sitting down. I believe this is a portrait taken by Matthew Brady, a famed Civil War photographer. He's wearing not only the collar of a 33rd, but he's also has the jewel, the decoration on. The other picture is him looking quite extravagant, quite fancy. He looks very knightly, if you will, very medieval, perhaps. He's in a tunic. And in fact, this is probably the picture that set me on a rabbit chase. I had never been huge into really looking into the evolution of our Scottish Rite regalia until a couple years ago. And a picture came out in the Knight Templar magazine, and it had this picture over here of Pike standing in front of these banners and in this uniform, and it said it was Albert Pike in Templar regalia, and it was a nice article, but it was really kind of talking up how Pike was a huge aficionado of the Templars in the York Rite. What's funny is this is not a York Rite picture at all, in the least. This is Pike in the regalia of a 33rd. There's nothing York Rite about this picture. It is wholly a Scottish Rite photo. And we're going to talk more about what he's wearing. This is very much what a 33rd would wear during the ritual, during meetings. I mean, this is your stock uniform, if you will. Not that we would ever see it too much, but again, that's what we're getting at, is this idea. So regalia in a base sense, we can take it a lot of different ways. And we see a lot of different pictures and images and connotations of how we should dress and what regalia was worn, and depending upon your jurisdiction, there's other things like sashes and the like. What we do know from the earliest version of the ritual and the earliest inklings, things like the Franken manuscript, there's not a lot of specific ritual outlined in terms of ritual instruction towards what regalia is worn. It's noted as far back as the late 1800s that you don't always have to be in a complete, full formal regalia. At the reception of candidates and upon other ceremonial occasions, inspectors general may wear the ordinary evening dress of society or other black clothing in lieu of the uniform mentioned, talking about the more formal uniform. And such jewels and decorations of the rite as may be entitled to their rank. So this idea of wearing a tux during a conferral or a meeting, wearing white tie, it's not foreign at all. And the idea of wearing formal clothing with just the base regalia, not out of the realm of any use. And we'll see that kind of ripple through. The current regalia, what we're familiar with today, has really been around less than 100 years. Of course, we are very much in the southern jurisdiction. I realize jurisdictions differ here. We're very much used to the caps, the prayer caps, whether worn with the hard side, if you will, the stiff sides, or if they're a crush cap. You see here the cap of the 32nd degree, the black cap, the red cap of the Knight Commander of the Court of Honor, a white cap of the 33rd degree or the Inspectors General Honorary, and then the cap of the SGIG, the Sovereign Grand Inspectors General. These caps have been around since the 20s, and their style is something that didn't just pop up, did not just come into play completely, and in fact was an evolution, likely from around the late 1890s up until 1927, when it was standardized. Over time, from the 1890s to that point, different styles of cap had come into play to be worn with dark suits, that type of thing. These caps could be visored caps. Perhaps if you look in your valley, you'll see pictures of guys wearing very low-topped visored caps with a double-headed eagle on the front. But there were also additional variations that you will see across different sources. This is a great example here. This is illustrious Alfonso Chase Stewart, who was the Sovereign Grand Inspector General of Missouri from, I believe, about 1808, 1809, up until right around World War I or the end of World War I. Stewart wears on his head a hat that in some ways is very similar to what we know. Now, do we know the colors exactly in this photo? No, but it appears to be a white hat with the normal 33rd SGIG patriarchal cross, the laurels around it. It's not purple in its entirety, which makes it kind of interesting. So, like what Stewart is wearing here in this photo, were prevalent and were widespread in their use. And it's because of these that it slowly kind of percolated. As things take hold, trends, ideas, they grow. And in this case, this trend kind of picked up of these prayer caps. And as such, we see its expanded use over time and a need for them to be codified. And the time for codifying them comes in 1927, when through the efforts of I'm going to get this wrong, so I want to tell you, the Committee on Jurisprudence and Legislation, they approve a report basically on the design of the caps. And these caps are basically laid out very specifically, and these are over here on the side, This is actually the official bulletin photo that was in the transactions. So this is actually what was included in the transactions, as this is specifically what it's supposed to be. And at that time, when they adopted these in October of 1927, only 6 styles were adopted: the Grand Commander, the SGIG, the 33rd, the Grand Cross, the Knight Commanders of the Court of Honor, and the Masters of the Royal Secret. Of course, there have been variations all over the fact, and nobody goes around really popping you on the head if your hat somehow is slightly different from exactly as it's written in the statutes. Over time, there are slight variations you'll see. I don't know if I've seen some that are completely embroidered and embossed as some of these are, at least in terms of the KCCH and the 32nd. But these styles are the ones that were adopted, and they picked up in the 20s, and we have them today. But of course, time leads on. We have 2 later editions. That is in 1945, the 50-year member cap comes around. This is another suggestion of John Cowles, Grand Commander Cowles, who basically says, hey, we need to recognize these senior members. And as such, it was an adopted cap. In 1981, illustrious Fred Kleinknecht comes up with the deputy cap, and that's part of his term, and that's presented. Prior to that time, a deputy is basically just wearing a 33rd cap. There's no distinction between a deputy and a SG or a regular inspector general, if you will. So those are the caps, but what significance do they have? Where do we bring any of their meaning from? Is there any meaning? Is there any relevance to them? Can we find any of that in the ritual? Well, from a modern context, not really. The best references we can find to the caps, in fact, since they've only been around since 1927 in an official way, they don't exist in the ritual, period, until the revised standard pike ritual. And if you were to look at the 18th degree now, in the 3rd apartment, the guardian of the temple informs us, you have noticed the different colors of the traditional British regimental caps worn by the Scottish Rite Brethren. Regimental because we as Scottish Rite Masons combat against vice and oppression for the good of humanity. But they also have a higher signification. As with the head covering used by medieval knights, they are not removed during prayers. The caps thus recall the piety of the ancient Israelites, whose history is the traditional foundation of Masonry. The colors of these caps suggest a progression. Of course, the caps going black, red, white, purple, not only of honors, but also of personal growth. The colors originate as the hangings of the 3 chambers of this degree in the symbols of alchemy. Keep in point, in the 18th degree, there are 3 apartments. The first apartment is hung in black, the second apartment hung in red, and the 3rd apartment in white, which you can relate your own decisions about its alchemical significance. But it is here in the revised standard pike ritual that they allude to the caps. This is the only degree that does it. This is the only point that it's pointed out. No such references exist in any other form of the ritual relating to the caps, their purpose, significance, or anything like that. Now, those caps are neat. We talked about Alfonso Chase Stewart having a very unique hat before they were adopted. I mean, he had his cap, and that picture dates from 1809. So he had that picture taken then, and he's wearing a cap. Well, what other caps were there? What other hats existed? Well, the 1897 statutes, and I'm going to use that as kind of our tipping point here, because they match very well with earlier statutes. They referenced that the inspectors general honorary should have a hat that is of the same style as the kadosh. And on the inspector's general hat, they should wear a red, a black, and a white feather. Red, black, white feather. Interesting. They're coming up again here. Red, black, and white feather. But what is this hat? They have the hat that's the same as the Kadosh. Well, maybe we need to do a little bit more digging. Per the Kadosh of the 1880s, the Kadosh hat is a wide-brimmed hat of black felt with a plume of red ostrich feather on the left side, which is turned up, and on the lower end of the plume covered with its pinned side, a Teutonic cross of gold. So that's a broad-brimmed hat, one side pinned up with a Teutonic cross of gold, and on the front of it, we have this imagery you see here over on the side, with the radiant sun and the letters for Aleph and Nun, representing Nikam Adonai, which you can reference back to the 30th degree or other versions of the 32nd. I would leave that to you to discern its meaning. But keeping in point a couple things here as we talk about this. This hat, broad-brimmed, felt, it's black, it's pinned up on one side, Teutonic cross on the side. It's got this radiant sun in the middle of the front, Aleph and Nun on the sides, representing Nakam Adonai. And the Kadosh in the 30th degree are representative, at least in the older iterations of the Scottish Rite, at least in a mindset perspective. They're the foot soldiers. These are the general population membership to a degree. These are the soldiers. So their regalia is the base we build off of. Keep that in mind as we go forward. The 30th degree is the base we build off. So their hat is the starting point. So if their hat has a plume of red, a black felt, it has a plume of red feather. We already just talked about the 33rds having red, black, and white feathers. You can see there's already a little bit of differentiation. But that differentiation is across the board. These broad black felt hats looked the same for everybody, other than the plume of feathers you had coming out of the back. The Knights Kadosh had one feather, one plume, and it was red. Perhaps a reminder of aimless blood spent, the innocent blood spilt. You could take it however you want. That's kind of what comes to my mind when I think about it. The Master of the Royal Secret, the 32nd degree, has the same hat with a red plume and a black plume. So we have red and black now. And then the 33rd has a plume of red, black, and white, as we talked about earlier. So the hat stays the same. We're just increasing the feathers, just getting bigger and bigger. Not as ridiculous as some chapeaus you see in Knight Templar commanderies, but probably just as showy in some ways with the plumes. Now, the real question is, are these hats really gone? Is the description laid out in terms of these hats disappeared? Can we wear them still? Will we look ridiculous? Perhaps. But is it really gone from our ritual? Is it really scrubbed from our practices? We'll come back to that. The next thing we're going to talk about briefly is rings, because this is the other key piece of regalia we have in the Scottish Rite. There are only two official rings, of course, within the Scottish Rite, sanctioned by the statutes. That's the ring of the 14th degree and the 33rd ring. We're all very, very familiar with the 14th degree ring, with its triangle and yud upon it, inside of which is engraved or stamped the Latin phrase representing what virtue is united and death shall not separate. Additionally, by the ritual, you should have your name inscribed in it and the date you received the 14th degree ring. This, of course, is coupled with the other ring, which is the ring of the 33rd degree, which, of course, is three bands held together, if you will, the triangle on the front with the 33. Their motto, God and my right, inscribed inside with their name, the date they received it. Those are the rings as we are now used to them. Let us go and crack open the transactions from 1927, though, and look to the allocution of illustrious John Cowles. And this is where I think we're going to find something interesting. Cowles, in a lot of ways, made slight changes over time, but his biggest sweeping changes, we could say, in a lot of the outward appearance of the Rite seem to have happened in 1927, 28, when he changed not only the caps, or advocated the changing to a standardized cap system, but he also changed the rings. And he tells us a comment on the ring of the 14th degree. I believe it appropriate in connecting this with the subject of the rituals. More attention is now being paid than ever and more attention is being paid now than ever in the promises of those to wear the rings more than ever before. I'm convinced a greater improvement will be made if brethren are permitted to wear the ring on any finger of any hand, and that it be placed upon some device as a means of identification. Coming into contact with a man wearing a plain flat band, as described in our statutes, one would wonder if he's in the Rite. Hazards asks the question and receives a dumbfounded look by the wearer. In a reply that he had never heard of the Scottish Rite. Or a widow, maybe wearing one, given to her according to the promise made by her husband, who felt it was a good protection to her, but who will run the risk in speaking to a stranger of being considered an inquisitive busybody, for fear the ring should not be a Scottish Rite one. Let something be done so that the ring speaks its rightful language and do away with surmises. We can well follow our sister jurisdictions to the north in adopting the same device and mark as it provides. Besides, some of our bodies are already doing it. The foregoing aptly applies for the 33rd ring. So by this point, the northern jurisdiction had already changed their 14th degree ring. It had already reflected and looked very similar to ours. But what did ours look like? We're going to talk about that in a minute. It was, as Cowles notes, a flat band. It was ambiguous. It literally looked like a wedding band with no outside ornamentation. And here you see actually a 14th degree ring. And you can find these for sale on eBay all over the place if you look. Not as often because they're going to be before the 20s. But it's a flat gold band with the motto inscribed inside it, the brother's name and the date of the degree. You can still do this if you chose, I suppose. But this is what it was. And Cowles's driving point was that it was so plain, perhaps brothers were put into an awkward situation because it really wasn't showing their membership or their adherence to it. Or if a brother had actually done as the ritual allocates and given it to his widow, she'd be put into an awkward situation if some brother walks up and sees her wearing a plain band and says, do you need assistance? Are you a widow of a Scottish Rite member? So their hope was by making this shift, it would change that. So this idea of the ring itself being shifted comes about in that year, to the point that we see it noted later that the Committee on Jurisprudence and Legislation outlines that the rings should have those various devices, the numeral 33 within a triangle, or the Hebrew letter Yud engraved within a triangle, to be received by all of those receiving those degrees. And this was adopted very much in the sense that we now see this regalia. Nothing really different here at all, other than we went from plain to having engraving. So the 33rd degree was a triple band with nothing on it. And so it was nothing on it at all. And then they add now the triangular shaped plate with the 33 numeral. The perfect elu was a plain gold band. They add the equilateral triangle and the Hebrew letter Yud. So those are the big first things we want to address before we kind of tackle the more fun discussion here in terms of extravagance is what I would kind of consider it. And that is the complexity of what this regalia used to really be set as. And everything, like I said, bases off this idea that 30th degree, you're the foot soldier. If you think about the 30th degree, my brothers, from the perspective of the ritual, the 30th degree is where you're told the great secret, if you will, of the Scottish Rite in terms of who the Scottish Rite is, if that makes sense to everybody, if you get where I'm going with that. So that's the equaling degree at that point. So beyond that is the much more command position, sage position, if you will. So the regalia we know about. We're not going to hearken too much to this to discuss, because some of this plays in, but not all of it. Obviously, in this degree, you're shown several things: a sword, a sash. You're given a poignard. You're told, "Here's all this regalia. You know, you're a knight now." What you guys, or what you see now on the side of your screen, this brother here in full dress, per se, is in the regalia of the 30th degree as described in the ritual. As described. So your 30th degree, if all your brothers were in uniform, this is what they'd be wearing, as it matches to the actual ritual, as it's noted. The mantle is black velvet. There's a Latin cross on it. The clasp is a Teutonic cross. You wear a tunic, pantaloons of white, so tights, yellow Moroccan boots. So these are yellow boots with little tassels. You have gold spurs. If you remember in this degree, as the postulant, as the neophyte going through the degree, they put spurs on you to urge you on in your battle. The sword belt and the sword are in accordance with the ritual. We're going to talk about swords later, but what I find often is that the swords we use in a lot of our Scottish Rite activities are not to the statutes. They look cool. No means am I knocking any of them, because some of them are some of the neatest pieces of craftsmanship I've ever seen, but they don't often actually meet what the statutes are. In most cases, the statutes represent a sword that's much, much, much more plain than some of the fancier things we see. The brother wears the cordon or sash under the mantle and over his tunic. And this is his uniform. This is the day. This is actually what you'd wear if you were to go out and have a procession. Really, if you were going to have the Knights Kadosh process for some parade, this would be the uniform. The Master of the Royal Secret. We know this regalia. We've seen it before. Here's a picture of Pike in the older version of this regalia. What he's wearing over here much more ties to the ritual pre-1880, which at that point was just basically a darker frock coat description, if that. But their uniform, very similar to the Kadosh, very similar, but slight changes. Again, like I said, the 30th degree is a base mold, and we build on it. What is different here? First off, there's gold fringe. The sleeves are a little bit let out more. The cloak is crimson velvet lined with white silk. We still have the white tunic, the pantaloons, the boots, and the spurs of the Knight Kadosh. The cordon is worn and can be worn. It's not in this picture, but it's worn from the right shoulder to the left hip. You can wear the girdle, so the sash of the 30th degree could be worn under this if desirous. And if you're in a public setting, the commander-in-chief, so the venerable Master of Kadosh, would wear a robe of crimson silk with the mantle over top of it. He would not wear this uniform. Every member should be regularly armed with a triangular shield and sword. We don't often see the shield talked about in our regalia, but it is actually part of it. And if you were to read the traditional layout of the consistory's meeting room, you would find that each Master of the Royal Secret has their own basic own separate seating area where their shield can be hung from, basically their own stall. Garter, the stalls you see like in the Garter Chapel and with some of the nightly orders in England. The apron, of course, is not typically worn. But again, I just want to reiterate here, we see the black felt hat, the Teutonic cross pinning it up, the sun radiating here with the Aleph and Nun representing Nakam Adonai on the hat. And of course, in this case, he has a black feather and a red feather representing the fact that he is a 32nd degree or Master of the Royal Secret. Notably, he's got that Passion Cross on his chest. And if we go back and look at our brother here, he too has those Passion Cross. You notice the change in feathers. You notice the changes in fringe and things like that that differentiate them ever so slightly. I do want to note real quickly, and we'll touch on it in a minute. Most are aware, if you're not a member of the Southern Jurisdiction has a rank and decoration known as the Knight Commander of the Court of Honor. It is in other Supreme Councils, and it's not just held to us, but it was created by Albert Pike in the 1870s. A brother who is a Knight Commander of the Court of Honor is set apart in rank and decoration, if you will, but they are still a Master of the Royal Secret. As such, there is no real difference in the uniform or regalia they would wear compared to any other Master of the Royal Secret. The only difference would be the jewel. They could wear the jewel. The synthetic badge is a much more recent addition to the KCCH regalia box, if you will. But the jewel would be really your only telltale that they were a KCCH. And of course, we've all seen pictures like this, and we talked about it earlier. The idea in the statutes does list that formal wear can be utilized as needed. The sword of the 32nd is kind of something I want to hit on real briefly. The statutes and ritual tell us it should be a rapier blade, straight and double-edged, 33 inches long, with a hilt of yellow metal, the helmet on the end with a lion, and then the traverse bar should be lion-headed with 32 right there. That's it. No fancy crossbones, no skulls. That's simple. And that is the sword of the 32nd degree. And as an example, you can see here on your side, this is a screenshot of what that actually would look like at the traverse bar, at the hilt, with the lion's heads there. That's really as simple as it is. And even the 33rd sword is actually very, very close to this. I got a very good chuckle out of the Supreme Council's Tyler sword, since that they're now offering for donors to buy. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece, but it's pretty far off from what any of the statutes or our rituals say it would be. Here is an interesting picture when we talk about the legacy of the regalia, its adoption and its use. This picture comes from the very late 1890s, turn of the century, St. Louis, Missouri. And in fact, you see here, the gentleman sitting in the center with the white ribbon jewel represents Martin Collins. He was the SGIG of the state of Missouri. And then surrounding him are the members of our consistory at that time. You notice these two brothers, very close to being in the regalia and uniform. They have the felt hats with the plumes. They have the mantles properly closed. They have the tunics, but you notice there's no fringe on the tunics, and you notice they're not wearing boots or pantaloons. Very easily, this makes sense in a lot of ways. The cost and the expense of that uniform, as we kind of highlighted, even then, is a bit prohibitive. Now, you can also notice in this group, we have a brother wearing the 32nd degree apron back here, a brother wearing the collar. It looks like here, from what you can kind of see waist-wise in this image, there may be a couple other brothers wearing aprons as well. So this idea of use and active implementation is kind of interesting. Was it widespread? In some valleys, perhaps. In most, I would say probably not. But this idea of the standardized uniform is kind of an interesting thing. Again, this comes from 1899 here in St. Louis with our consistory. Now, the flip side to this, and worth noting, is the undress uniform. The undress uniform is also listed in the statutes, and this is your, I don't want to call it a cop-out, but this is your get away free without having to worry about so much. The undress uniform is a hat, sword, and belt as prescribed by the ritual, and then a black frock coat buttoned up to the neck with black buttons, black pants, pantaloons, and boots of black leather. This applied to the Master of the Royal Secret, as well as a kadosh. The only difference between a 30th degree brother and a 32nd degree brother wearing them is that the 32nd degree brother would wear white gloves, and they could wear the cordon and apron of the degree in combination with this. Now, what does this look like? Well, I was able to find at least one good photo. It's not the best photo, but it does the trick. This is actually from Albert Pike's funeral when his body laid in wake. You can see it's actually in a lodge room. And you see the brothers around him in the black felt hats with the sides pinned up, wearing the proper belts, black frock coats buttoned up, black boots, black pants, and gloves. The undress uniform. This isn't a Templar uniform. This is the undress uniform of the kadosh. And that's, of course, the challenge is the crossover and use of the time. There are occasional similarities where people misidentify. As we already noted, very simply, the Knight Commander of the Royal of the Court of Honor is a Master of the Royal Secret. Other than the jewel, you wouldn't be able to tell any real big difference in his regalia. The 33rd degree, though, this is where we get a little bit of a change up. He wears the tunic, pantaloons, boots, and spurs of a kadosh. His cloak is crimson, and if you notice in this picture of Pike, Pike has the one side of his mantle opened, so you can see the underside, but the outer side is over here, so it's crimson, and it's edged in gold, which we can even see the gold right there, and lined with white silk. The cross on the tunic over the left breast is in white, and we can't really make that out the way the tunic is. The hat is, of course, the hat of the kadosh with 3 feathers in it, white, black, and red. You notice he's wearing what looks to be not exactly the broad brim felt we would expect. It looks almost like a Homburg with a little broader of a brim. And additionally, they wear a girdle to be a military sash of black silk, fringed on one edge with gold, as the cordon is worn from the right shoulder to the left hip. So you see this sash underneath, and I apologize for my spelling errors in that. You see this sash going underneath his collar. That is the other ancillary piece of their regalia. And of course, he's wearing the sword, the belt, and he has the collar of the 33rd. The collars themselves and the sashes is kind of an interesting topic. Not being a 33rd, I can't reference to you if this is still inherent within the ritual instruction, but I'll tell you how it stands in the older statutes. The collar you see Pike wearing in that picture, and you see an image of here, was worn by active and maritime members of the Supreme Council who may wear a white velvet collar. Brothers who are inspectors general honorary are entitled to wear the broad scarf or cordon of white watered silk from their right shoulder to the left hip. So you have the collar itself for the actives and the sash for those brothers who are not active members of the Supreme Council. And of course, do we still see this? Yes, we do. And again, with all this, with all the pomp, the circumstance, the uniforms, the fringe, the cost is quite exorbitant, perhaps. But it's not insurmountable. Did Pike have a preference? Did Pike think, for all the regalia in the Scottish Rite, we need to do something, or we need to get rid of it all? Well, he does kind of tell us. He gives us a glimpse into his opinion. In the 20th degree in Morals and Dogma, in his lectures, he writes, "As a master, you will teach those who are under you, and to who you will owe your office, that the decorations of many degrees are to be dispensed with, so we don't need them. Whenever the expense would interfere with the duties of charity, relief, and benevolence." So if all that regalia is going to block you from your duty to practice charity, relief, and benevolence, don't do it. Or if it's going to exist only to be indulged in by only the wealthy bodies that can do no wrong to their entitled insistence, don't worry about it. The essentials of all degrees may be procured at slight expense. And it is the option of every brother to procure or not procure, as he pleases, the dress, decorations, and jewels of any degree other than the 14th, 18th, 20th, and 32nd. And of course, by default, the 32nd would mean you'd have the 30th degree. So Pike basically says, it's your option to either procure it, to get it or not, whenever you want, the dress and jewels of any of the degrees, other than the 14, 18, 20, 32nd. Those are the important ones you should have the regalia for. And I think that's kind of an interesting perspective for him to have. And truthfully, while that may seem aggressive, there's a couple things to think about here really briefly. One, the 18th degree as a good example. If you were to have the regalia of the 18th degree per the Pike ritual, it's all black. Doesn't really state if it's a cassock like we wear in our work now for the most part, or a gown, but it's a black gown of some form. There's no crosses or anything embroidered on it. Of course, there is the chasuble, but you don't wear that except in the degree. That's the only time it really gets worn. And then the apron and the collar. And then your hat. The 18th degree is a good example of form being brought, imitated life, being imitated and brought into the work. You see many 18th degrees that are very, I don't want to call them religious, but they have a Catholic undertone in the sense that you'll have guys wearing berettas and a mitre, and it looks very, very ecclesiastical. That's not in the ritual. It just says you have a head covering, a black cap. It could be a Homburg for all they care. So a lot of these aren't the insurmountable odds that we see, but it's an interesting dynamic. Now, to change pace for just a moment and think just for a second, okay, this is all cool information, Jake. Neat. Does it really all matter? Does it all still have any play, if you will? Well, that's a good point. I don't disagree. And I'm trying to find what I was going to tell you, but I can't find it. Does it have any play? Well, first off, I'd encourage you next time you get to talk to your director of work, ask them to look through a little bit of the ritual you have. Because interestingly enough, 9 times out of 10, even the Revised Standard Pike still has that full description that I just gave you earlier of the Kadosh uniform. It's still in the 32nd degree. And interestingly enough, our statutes, as they still stand, as they are still written, the clothing and uniforms shall be as such as are prescribed in the rituals and liturgies. The uniforms never disappear. The regalia never disappeared. Now, notably, we do have that great little line here. At the reception of candidates and on other ceremonial occasions, brethren may wear the ordinary evening dress of society or other black clothing. That line has been around since the dawn of it all. If you can't procure the uniform, here's your other option. Now, further, we look here. This comes to us from 1897, Article 15, Clothing, Arms, Symbols, and Honors of the Supreme Council section. No brother shall be permitted to sit in any body of the Rite unless he is properly clothed with the collar, apron, and jeweled degree in which the body is open, or of a higher degree. Inspector generals may wear the tunic, pantaloons, boots, spurs of a kadosh, as described in the liturgy. The hat of each is the same as the hat of the kadosh. On it, the inspector general wears a red, white, black feather, and it goes into detail of the full regalia. And then, of course, it does remind us at the reception of a candidate or other ceremonial occasions, they may wear the ordinary evening dress. And it then outlines that, the undress. The 33rd degree sword, it even goes into. The 33rd degree sword, guys, is almost exactly like the 32nd degree sword, except on the hilt, you got the number 33. There's no cross swords or anything crazy or anything like that. So there's some interesting dynamics here to the regalia, to its symbolism. What I find important about it, what I find worth us kind of having an awareness and a cognitive reflection is the importance of what it means, what it symbolizes, what significance there is in a uniform. What it means in the long run. For the Rite, as our ritual lays forth, having this purpose to serve humanity, but to be a soldier of the true religion, a soldier of the people, a soldier of freedom, a soldier of the Scottish Rite, a soldier of fraternity. This uniform represents that. Now, perhaps not so much in the modern soldier sense, but in that older perspective. And it harkens us back to that Templaric idea, which our order seeks to emulate. So, with that being said, brothers, I said this was going to be kind of a shorter presentation, much more detailly, and kind of hashing through a few things. But the key takeaways from it all, these uniforms, these practices still exist. They're still reasonably functional, and definitely doable. I see guys in valleys today that have very, very similar arrangements for their regalia, for their degree teams. Others have went to the evening dress in certain degrees where it's prescribed. But the significance here, the symbolism here of this military mindset, this fact that the uniforms kind of get a little bit grander, but it's the same base. I think there's some importance to it. I think also when we reflect back to the rings, the 14th degree ring, the 32nd degree ring, the simplicity of them before and after is there, but that inherent simplicity of what they mean, profound. Of course, today with our caps, that's our more noticeable outward sign in our meetings, but they're a reminder. However we want to look at it, they're a reminder of that military tradition, even if we don't wear a broad brimmed felt cap with the side pinned up and all the feathers. It's a reminder of those vows. It's a reminder of those duties we have taken upon us. So with that said, we will open the floor for any comments or questions, and then we will kind of wrap up, brothers. I appreciate your attention as we've kind of covered this. We look forward to kind of kicking this lecture series back in as we dig into some deeper topics. And we look forward to later this summer bringing you guys some great lectures. So we'll open the floor now. If there's any comments, questions, unmute yourself and ask away. We are still, of course, recording. Once, twice. No questions is a good question some days. I would mention, just as kind of an interesting point, and hopefully it'll come to fruition. We do have some plans up here in the Orient of Missouri between a small group of brothers that we're actually planning on bringing these uniforms back in full function for an education piece, not to mandate and have 300 Scottish Rite guys in uniform going down the street, but much more for a education piece that we'll be able to use here in our Orient. Um, Other than that, a couple other things I would note, just for the sake of it, obviously. Uh, Again, these uniforms are all still part of of the ritual. They're all still revised pike layered in there, and definitely a neat little piece of it. I'd encourage you kind of read through them and kind of look at how they fit together. It is kind of just an interesting deal. What I will talk about is if you look at that picture of Pike, Pike's an imposing guy anyway, but that's an imposing uniform in one way or another. It's very much more knightly than wearing like a double-breasted frock coat, which some Supreme Councils use as their uniform for the 32nd degree. It's much more chivalric in that sense. And because of the uniform like that, it has such an impressive nature. And we don't know it for sure, but we do know that in Missouri, in 1868, I believe, after the Civil War, there were some issues between the Grand Encampment, or not the Grand Encampment, the Grand Commandery of Missouri, and the Supreme Council. Our Grand Commandery of Knights Templar in Missouri tried to bar anyone from joining the Scottish Rite who was not a Knight Templar. We have done a lecture on this. You can watch it in the recordings. It did not go well. I'll put it that way. Albert Pike and the Grand Commander of Missouri went at a war in the newspapers against each other. You can bet who won. His first name's Albert, and he won pretty severely. He put our Grand Commander in his place. But what they ended up doing, and I think actually kind of won them the PR battle, if you will, is the next session that the Supreme Council had, which was less than 6 months after this started. They held a public procession in Regalia. Now, we don't know if that meant they were wearing the full regalia you see in the picture, or if they were just in dark suits and collars. But I guarantee you, if the Supreme Council, 30 some odd guys with all the Scottish Rite Masons from St. Louis at that time, with banners and everything, holding a procession down a street, you want something that looks probably pretty impressive back then. It probably was. And it was kind of the turning point, at least in the PR battle side of it. So interesting uniform. Of course, another thing somebody pointed out in the discussion, and it is worth mentioning, the hats are not standardized across the world, nor the jurisdictions. There are some jurisdictions that have no hats at all. Some do. Some have only hats for 33rds. Some have hats for only guys who are officers. The southern jurisdiction just kind of as a carte blanche. Almost everybody wears a cap. Couple of valleys are a little different than that. Even the northern jurisdiction, where you'll often hear guys say there are no caps, you'll find valleys and orients in their jurisdiction where everybody wears a cap. It's just their tradition there. But that's a good point to make. They're not a standardized piece. But other than that, guys, I appreciate your attention. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening. Our next lecture will be announced in the coming weeks. Should be in mid-September sometime. So we will see you guys soon. Have a good one.